But Dr. Hoffmeier is going to talk for roughly 35, 40 minutes. Please hold your questions to the end. Love to get a lot of dialogue going, so write down your questions if you can, and then we'll have a brief Q&A time, and then we'll close in prayer. So join me in welcoming Dr. Hoffmeier.
Well, I realize you could all be at home watching the debate. I'm grateful for DVR. But the one problem I do have tonight is that when I set this up, I completely forgot that today is the 41st anniversary of my first date with my wife. So I'm in deep doo-doo. I've been up here all day. Anyway, but we'll move on. Mention has been made of my book, The Immigration Crisis, and largely the things I say will come out of that, however, not exclusively. This talk was originally put together, at least a PowerPoint of this, for a think tank in Washington where I was asked to speak, and my audience was largely non-Christian. And so I began with a question, why bother looking at the Bible on a question like immigration? And first point, of course, is that as Christians, Christians look to Scripture for guidance on ethical decisions, as we should. However, what really intrigued me and what really got me into this book in the first place was I was surprised at the level of reference to the Bible in public discourse, that in this case, Bible thumping, something that's usually evangelicals and fundamentalists are said to do, was actually being done by people at the liberal end of the both political spectrum and the religious spectrum. So you'll find verses from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, so I use that when I'm speaking in an audience where they're Jews, are used to support illegal immigration by organizations like Christians for Comprehensive Immigration Reform. The Sojourners quote Bible verses on their website as a basis for their advocacy. So the reality is, whether we like it or not, or whether we think it's appropriate or not, the Bible is being used in this debate. Some of the favorite verses that are used, and they're wonderful verses, is do not mistreat the alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So we read in biblical law. Similarly, in Leviticus 34, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So these are the verses that you frequently find in this connection. I found this quote in the Washington Post shortly after the Arizona law came in a couple of years ago, and it was by a minister, Deborah Hafner of the Unitarian Universal Church. And I'm always a little wary when a Unitarian Universalist starts quoting Scripture, because they rarely do. So when they do, I take notice. So she said, it's as if 70% of the Arizonans who support the law have forgotten the biblical injunction to love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So there you can see, directly quoting the passage in Exodus that I was just referring to. What I'd like to do before going on is to look at how we apply Old Testament law to New Testament ethics. Now, that's an entire course in and of itself. So my intention is not to do a thorough treatment of that. We do have a course that my colleague, Dr. Richard Averbeck, teaches called The Old Testament Law and the Christian. And certainly that's a course I would recommend the seminary students to take, because he really wrestles with this issue. How do we, as NT Christians, deal with OT matters? But there are basically 4 different approaches that are being used today. One is a one-to-one literal correlation, where you look at Old Testament laws or Old Testament injunctions and find a contemporary corollary and try to apply it. Some would call this theonomy, that is taking God's law and trying to make it the law of the land. This has not had a very successful history in our country, but there are theonomists out there. A second is to equate biblical justice with U.S. law. By this, I'm referring to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, in which he quotes from Amos, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an everlasting stream." And the very next line, he's quoting from the Declaration of Independence. And one can understand at that point in time the need for the U.S. Constitution to be fully applied to all citizens, regardless of race and ethnicity. But I think there are some people who see biblical justice as sort of a all-encompassing term that should be equated with U.S. law. Now, the next two are probably the two that as evangelicals we find ourselves most comfortable with, and that is to look at the Old Testament law either, and this is I'm doing this in two parts. One is looking at Old Testament narratives where we can glean certain ethical or moral teachings, and then on the other hand you have Old Testament laws where you have very explicit principles being laid out. So behind this then is to look at the Old Testament for what is the principle or moral guidelines that apply to current law or practice. So you may look at a very strange law, and by the way, I'm not just thinking in terms of the political arena, but let's say even in the Christian life or in the life of the church. So I'm thinking of a very strange law. You look at it, you read it, and you say, what the heck? You shall not boil a kid, a goat, in its mother's milk. Now that is the groundwork for why observant Jews will not eat cheeseburgers. That's their applying it. You don't mix milk product with a meat product. I was having dinner some years ago with a colleague, and at the end of our meal, I said, Ed, how about some dessert? I'm going to get some cheesecake. He said, oh, I can't have that. I just had meat. So no cheesecake because he had meat with his meal. Got to wait 4 hours. Okay? Now that was how in the Jewish community they try to apply it. Do not eat its kid in its mother's milk. Well, I look at that a little bit differently because I look at it in the context of the chapter it's in, and you'll see that chapter in Exodus 23 is actually talking about the 3 times a year that everyone comes before the Lord at the various times of harvest and offerings and so on to bring their first fruits, to bring of their offerings, to bring of their gifts to God for the fertility of the land. And then you read this verse about eating the kid in its mother's milk. Now I'm getting into another area, but you'll see that those are the kind of verses you look at and say, well, how does this apply to us? Well, contextually, the verse clearly has to do with what precedes it, and it appears that the boiling kid in its mother's milk was a pagan fertility ritual. And so in the context of fertility of the annual Thanksgiving and first fruits, God is saying, you thank God for the fertility of your land. Don't engage in pagan practices. So once I understand that, it's a warning to be careful to not engage in syncretistic practices of pulling in pagan practices into my Christian life and experience. But in any event, that's looking for a principle that you might apply. The last and fourth is what some of you may be familiar with, the writings of Christopher Wright, who's written a number of books for InterVarsity Press, Walking in the Ways of the Lord, excellent book. But his approach is to try to take a comprehensive biblical worldview rather than just proof texting, rather than just looking at this verse or that verse, but looking more broadly through the lens of creation, the fall, redemption, and new creation. In other words, looking at the main lines of biblical theology as a lens through which you look at particular issues in our time. And obviously the benefit of the latter is that rather than just looking at sort of individual issues, you're looking through a more broad understanding of the teachings of Scripture, so that when you're looking at issues involving people, you want to remember that people are made in the image of God, things like that. So I thought I'd just go through this because obviously as Christians we think about this far more than non-believers who will use Scripture when it's convenient and of course run away from it most of the rest of the time. Now, I want to move next into something of trying to deal with a context behind the biblical understanding of immigrants and immigration, and especially as it pertains to biblical law. One of the things that we perhaps don't understand about the ancient world, although we understand it quite clearly now, is that borders, that is between nations and people groups, were a serious matter. These were not just arbitrary categories. I'll try to show that in a moment. But wars were fought to settle issues of border disputes, as they are today, as they have been throughout history. My point is that very often people think when looking at the current situation that we're dealing with a modern construct, the idea of nations and borders and so on. This is something modern that didn't exist in the Old Testament days when the biblical law was being made, and therefore we have to look at these issues differently. My point is that's not true. Borders were taken seriously, and I'll illustrate that more. Clearly defined borders were the order of the day. Border forts and lookouts monitored the movements of people to control who's coming into your country. And I know this because, well, I'll show you in a moment. We also have evidence that permits were granted for foreign people to enter another country. In other words, you couldn't just walk up to another country and waltz in and expect that you would be welcomed and admitted without some scrutiny. And I'll show you the evidence for this. On the latter point, what you're looking at is a scene from an Egyptian tomb. It's a very large presentation in the tomb of the man on the right who is standing and looking like an Egyptian. And he is a governor of the middle part of Egypt. And there is this interesting band of people in the red area, and you can see they're dressed very differently than the Egyptians in the scene. And a closer look at these. Sorry, there's the governor. Here's a closer look at these foreigners who are coming into Egypt with very different beards, different clothes than the Egyptians, etc. Notice they don't walk like Egyptians. And this chap, who the inscription identifies as the scribe, is holding in his hand the visa of this group of foreigners coming into Middle Egypt. It basically has the permission, and it tells us this is year 6 under the reign of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Khafre Senwosret II, and it tells us that this group of people from the West Semitic world, from Western Asia, has come to this particular governor, and it actually tells us how many is in the group. And there you see that number across the bottom. There are 37 in this band right there. 1, 2, 3, that's 30. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 37. So here's, if you will, a group permit for this clan to come into Egypt. And by the way, it's actually a type of work permit. They're coming in to do mining in the district of this governor. So they received this permission at the border of Egypt. So as they've traveled to where they want to work, they've been showing this along the way, and finally it's presented to the governor of this area, who says, okay, you got the permits, you may go to work. Mention was made that I've been doing work in North Sinai. That was really from the mid-1990s to about 2008 when our project wrapped up. But one of the things we've done is to reconstruct Egypt's border, both in terms of the ancient environment and the archaeological sites. And the brown line you see actually represents the road in and out of Egypt, which, and then these yellow rectangles you see are actual forts that guarded that road as you would have come into Egypt during the 2nd millennium BC. And the site I excavated, where we spent almost a decade, was right in here. And we found the fort. Well, that's me squatting, looking down at the work of the director of this part of our field Mr. James Knudstead, and what he's standing in and what I'm standing on is an actual moat that was a part of the fort. So this is the moat, and inside of it there would have been walls. Here's a wall of part of this fort, but there are actually two forts that span about 300 years of time. So when one fort was falling into disuse, another one is built to replace it. For 300 years, this helped guard the border to Egypt. And so, by the way, when the Exodus occurred, the Israelites had to get by these forts going out. So it was a double-edged sword to get you coming or going in the case of the Israelites. But just to illustrate that borders were taken seriously, look at Numbers chapter 20. This is after the Israelites had been in Sinai. Sinai was a no man's land, or an any man's land. That is, anybody could live there, but who wants to live there? Really nobody. And so no king, no nation actually owned it or controlled it. So the Israelites were able to spend their 40 years in relative obscurity, but when they went to leave Sinai, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel. Remember, the Edomites are the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. Hundreds of years later, thus says your brother Israel, you know the hardship that we have met, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and here we are at Kadesh, a city on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your land. He's asking for permission just to go through. We will not pass through field or vineyard or drink water from your well. We will just go along the King's Highway, the main north-south travel route. We will not turn aside to the right, to the left, until we have passed through your territory. But Edom said, you shall not pass through, lest I come out against you with a sword. And the people of Israel said, we will go up by the highway, and if we drink your water, and I and my livestock, then I will pay you for it. We will even pay you for permission to go through, and if we use any of your resources. But he said, you shall not pass through. And Edom came out against him with a large army and a strong force. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel had to turn away. Borders were taken seriously. So the first point I want you to get is that when this issue is discussed, this matter of borders and people coming in and going out, whether legally or illegally, this has been an issue that's with us for thousands of years. This is not a new issue. And so it's not surprising the Bible Old Testament has a lot to say about immigrants and rules and laws, etc. Here's just a map to show you what Israel and its neighbors looked like around 930 BC, where you can see very clear boundaries, borders between nations, including Judah and Israel, the kingdom of Edom at the bottom, Moab, Ammon, Aram, modern-day Syria, Phoenicia, the Philistines. These were clearly established lines, often established by negotiation, by battles, and so on. So this is really the area of historical geographers. They love to study the biblical texts, ancient texts, determine where boundaries were, and so on. So hopefully this question has been answered. Those who try to say that the whole notion of borders is a modern thing and modern law, and the reality is it's been with us a long time. Now the important question that we need to answer, because this is relevant to the question, and I'm thinking mostly in the public policy arena, when people take the verses, the wonderful verses in the Bible about the alien, and as I say, some of these have been used by Christian organizations, by secular organizations appealing to the Bible, and these wonderful verses that we read about not abusing the alien and so on. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what is an alien, or who is an alien, or a stranger, or a sojourner? My first reaction as I started looking into this, and this goes back about 6-7 years ago when I first started studying this seriously, and I must admit, when I started my book, I had no idea which direction it was going to take me. I didn't enter this book as with an agenda. I was curious what the Bible had to say, and I often have to the conclusions I come to on this subject, some people find offensive and may even think of me as some sort of xenophobic, whatever you want to call. But just for the record, the woman I've been married to for 38 years is Chinese. My son-in-law is Filipino. My grandchildren don't look anything like me, and they're wonderful, and I love them. And I was born in Africa and lived in Africa the first 16 years of my life. I was the foreigner living in a foreign land. What I'm trying to do is simply be honest with the Bible and not be driven by some of the emotional, visceral kind of discussions that go on this day. There are different Hebrew terms used in the Bible, and they are variously translated. And some of the problems stem from the fact that different translations render words differently. First of all, there is a verb. It's the verb gur or gore. As a verb, it occurs 32 times, and it means to sojourn or to live as an alien, depending on the translation you're looking at. Then there's the noun, which comes from the verb, and that's the verb ger. You all remember the name Ger from the name of the son of Moses. Moses' son was Gershom, because he was living as an alien in the land of Midian when he fled from Egypt. And so he named his son Gershom, an alien there. Okay? Now, look at the different ways this is translated. In the KJV, NASB, and Jerusalem Bible, ger is translated stranger. In the RSV and the ESV, it's translated sojourner, or as I found out when I was in England the other day, it's a sojourner. The NIV translates it as alien, and then the TNV and the NLT translates it foreigner. Now, if you look at the TNIV or you're a reader of the NLT, the New Living Translation, I have serious problems with that translation. The reason for my apprehension or disagreement with that translation is there's another word for foreigner, and it's the word nechar. The foreigner is the word, nechar is translated in the NIV, ESV, NASB, TNIV. It's translated stranger in the KJV. Now, so what happens with the TNIV, the official chapel Bible of the Trinity, the word nechar is translated foreigner, and so is the word ger translated foreigner. But these are two different words with two different meanings, and they should not be translated by the same English word. It's confusing. So let's take a look at these words. There's one more word. It's the word zar, which can be also translated foreigner, outsider, and is often foreigners who are invaders. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when they come in to attack Israel and Judah, they are called zar. Lamentations 5:2 refer to the squatters who moved into Israel when Israel was forcibly exiled from their country. The people who moved in were called zars. These are squatters who come in and really live off the misfortunes of others. Now, I want to get at this word ger, because I think that's the most important thing to understand. What is a ger? As I say, it occurs 80 times in the Bible, and we have the verb to ger, that is to be a ger, or to live as a ger, occurs 82 times. So 162 times we have either the noun or the verb form of this word, which means that's a pretty common practice and occurrence in the Bible. First of all, the ger is a foreigner living in another country, and this is my conclusion, with the permission of a host or a governing authority. And I'll give you examples of that. So the ger is a foreigner living in another country with the permission of a host or a governing authority. Look at the example here of Moses we talked about just moments ago. When Moses fled to the land of Midian, Jethro, who was the priest of that area, said to his daughters, then where is he? Where is this guy? Why have you left the man? Call him in, that he may eat bread. So he's invited in for a meal. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses, I'm sure a little time passed, his daughter to marry. And she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. But you'll notice that Jethro invites the man in, invites him to stay with him, to eat with him, and so on. Perhaps the best example is that of the Israelites themselves, who for hundreds of years were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And that's the whole point in the biblical law. You were sojourners. You know what it's like to be mistreated, so don't mistreat other sojourners. Don't mistreat other gers. Now, Joseph, as you know from the biblical story, had become a very important official in Egypt. And during this time of famine, when Jacob's brothers, or Jacob's sons, the brothers of Joseph, came to Egypt, they came with Pharaoh's invitation. Take a look at chapter 47 of Genesis, verse 6 and following. And this is the brothers talking. We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now please let your servants, and the translation dwell, it really is to sojourn. Please let your servants sojourn in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to them, to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come. The land is before you. Settle your family and your brothers in the best of the land. So they've actually come. And the language in Hebrew is very clear in that they are extremely deferential. Please let your servants dwell in the land. And they go on to say, look, we have our own flocks and our herds. We won't be a burden to you. We'll be able to take care of ourselves just as long as we have some water and some green pastures and so on. So here we have two very well-known stories in which you see that the host invites the foreigner to come in. And it's out of sense of compassion. These are rough times. We want to help you out. Now, what may be surprising to you is that even in Israel, a resident of Israel was required to get permission to settle in another tribal area within Israel. Now, that may seem strange at first until you remember that in the days of Joshua, all the territory of Israel was divided into tribal allotments. And the tribal allotments were divided among various clans and families and individuals. So that basically every piece of land in Israel was owned. There was no, if you will, state land. There was no common land. Everything was owned by somebody in the land. So that one Israelite who wants to leave his tribal territory and go to another one has to get permission to live there. That sounds awkward to us as Americans. What do you mean? If I want to move from Illinois to Pennsylvania, I got to get somebody's permission in Pennsylvania? No, well, we don't operate like that now, but they did in Israel. Here's a story from the book of Judges. Let me read this. Now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. Now remember, the Levites did not have their own tribe. There were Levitical cities scattered around, but a Levite who wanted to live in another part of the country, as we see here, had to get permission, even though he's a Levite. Now, let's read on. He sojourned there. So he had been living in Bethlehem, even though he was a Levite. So he had somebody's permission to live there. And the man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn where he could find a place. Now, that's a bit ambiguous. But in Hebrew, the word makom, place, is also used for a holy place, a sanctuary. So he's looking for a new ministry. Okay? He's looking for another church to go work at, to use our modern parlance. And he journeyed and he came to the hill country of Ephraim, the central part of Israel, to the house of Micah. And Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah. I am going to sojourn where I can find a place." A new, what we're not being told here, of course, is you're not supposed to worship at these places. You're supposed to worship at the sanctuary at Shiloh where the tabernacle was. So this is sort of illicit stuff. So not only is, but at least it illustrates my point. I'm a Levite from Bethlehem. I'm going to sojourn where I can find a place. And Micah said to him, stay with me. So he's invited into the tribe of Ephraim. You can come work for us. You're a Levite. And so come stay with me. And so he does. But here's a Levite, the clergy, and he has to be invited in to another part of the country and given permission to live, to sojourn. So the point then is that even Israelites going from one territory to another need the permission to live. Now, this is the ger, the sojourner, the alien, depending on your translation, the stranger. Now, in biblical law, what the Bible does for the sojourner is wonderful. Let me just categorize them. Number one, equal justice. This is Numbers 15. For the assembly there shall be one statute for you and the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever through your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before the Lord. One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you. Equal justice. One law. It's interesting that this word, ger, is often translated in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as the word where we get the English word proselyte. So the ger was not just seen as somebody who is a foreigner who lives in another, comes to live in Israel, but he's one who actually comes, lives, and converts. A good example would be Ruth. Okay? So, okay. Fair treatment by employers. You shall not oppress the hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. So don't oppress them. And this word oppress often has to do with not paying people for their work. And you are to treat them alike. One of the things that I think that goes on, and we're all aware of it in our country, is that very often the illegal immigrant is lured by jobs, but then paid under the table, under the minimum wage, and not receiving the benefits they should. And they're being exploited. Biblical law says you don't exploit a sojourner. They get paid the same as the homeborn. If you've invited them into your country, you've invited them into your community, then you have to treat them equally. There are social benefits. Gleaning in the fields. Again, remember the story of Ruth. When you reap your harvest in the field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back for it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Deuteronomy often brings these three categories of people together: the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widows. These are members of society who do not have adequate representation and protection, and they're the most easily exploited. And so here you see a very clear protection of these people, and because they don't have an own land, the only way they can get food is to actually glean in the fields. And so the story of Ruth, of course, is an excellent one. And if I might just go on a different tangent for a second here, one of the things that the story of Ruth does tell us, and you read it, you find out how hard she worked to glean in the fields. This was hard work. And I think one of the great tragedies of our time is where our social network is basically paying people not to work. And when the Bible opens up gleaning opportunities for the poor and the fatherless, the widow and the sojourner, it means that they're working alongside other people to make their living. It's just that I'm providing the opportunity for you. But it wasn't that Boaz had to go work all day, then go to Ruth and Naomi and said, here's your handout. No, they had to work for it. I think that's part of really protecting human dignity that I think, unfortunately, Western social law is missing out on. They were also beneficiaries of the tithes that were brought in, the once-a-year tithe. When you have finished paying all your tithe of your produce in the third year, the every 3-year tithe, which is the year of tithing and giving to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. So the clergy get their pay from the tithe, as well as the benefits that come. And by the way, bear in mind, we're dealing here in Old Testament times with a cashless economy. We're dealing, so payment would be in the form of grain, different food products. We're not dealing with currency, but food. So all you can do with it is eat it. Religious inclusion and participation. So the sojourner is not just one who gets the social benefits, the legal benefits, but they are to be included. So for instance, they can participate in Passover. The very first Passover, we're told that the sojourner could participate if they were circumcised. So by circumcision, they've entered into the Abrahamic covenant, and thus they are by faith true Israelites, even though they weren't by birth. But they could celebrate Passover. They could also present offerings at the tabernacle, Leviticus 22. But they are also obliged to keep the dietary laws. In other words, no bacon with your eggs, or whatever other dietary considerations. They also get the Sabbath off. So the sojourner was not to be exploited as somebody who could do your farm chores on the Sabbath. They too got the Sabbath off just like everyone else. Now, all of that is wonderful. And I think as Christians we look at that and I think there's a certain sense of that's right, that's fair, that's the just thing to do. You know, whether it's an appropriate thing in terms of public policy to think upon those lines, I think there is an argument that could be made in that way. I want to look at the nechar, the foreigner. And here's where it's absolutely crystal clear that the nechar and the ger are not one and the same, despite the TNIV and NLT's translation calling them both foreigner. So, they did not get the social benefits. The nechar, the foreigner, is not included in in the social benefits of gleaning and so on. They could not participate in the religious life of the community. You can even charge them interest. Remember, the Israelites were not to charge interest. When you loan something to a fellow Israelite or to a sojourner, you are not allowed to charge interest. But you could of a foreigner. By the way, that's one of the reasons that, the whole cliche about Jews and money. This goes back to the Babylonian exile and after, when many of them were in foreign lands and they realized that they could do banking because all their clients were foreigners. So it does have its roots there, which ironically has to do with survival when you don't have a lot else going for you. So they could charge interest to the foreigner. The foreigner explicitly could not be king, according to Deuteronomy. But the grandson of a sojourner could. David. Remember, Ruth was his grandmother, or great-grandmother. And the other thing, too, is that even if your animal dies, you could butcher your animal and have all the steaks you want. But if your animal died, natural causes or whatever, you couldn't eat it. Nor could the sojourner. But you could sell it to the foreigner, and the foreigner could eat it. So you can see these two categories are very different. The nechar, the foreigner, and the ger, the sojourner. Now, I wanted to talk we'll come to the end in a few minutes, and I'll try to at least make some observations about how this might work out in our own cultural context. The other thing that is quite big in North America that you may or may not be aware of is the practice of sanctuary cities. Chicago is a sanctuary city. LA, New York, New Haven, Denver, most of the major cities in the country are calling themselves sanctuary cities. What they're doing is taking the biblical idea of the sanctuary city, or the cities of refuge, that were an outgrowth of the sanctuary. When the Israelites are in the wilderness, all they had was the sanctuary, the tabernacle and the sanctuary. And the sanctuary was a place where you could go to have your case heard. When the Israelites came into the promised land, and they weren't all just living around the sanctuary, but were scattered 125 miles this way and about 20, 30 miles that way, the need for the cities of refuge became sort of as if they were extensions of the sanctuary. So there were 6 of these cities of refuge, okay? And the present day practice of sanctuary, at least what these cities are doing, is basically violating federal law. Federal law specifies that cities and states who find illegal immigrants in violation of the law are to turn them over to the federal authorities. Cities like Chicago have said, we're not going to do that. We are going to be a sanctuary city. So they're taking the biblical idea of the sanctuary city and saying, this is a place where you can come for refuge, where the big, strong arm of the law can't get you. And so that's behind the sanctuary city movement, which does function in violation of U.S. law. Okay, so the idea of sanctuary cities is based, in the Bible, is based on the biblical practice of fleeing to the sanctuary and clasping to the altar in order to avoid what is called the lex talionis, or the law of retribution, the eye for eye, tooth for tooth principle. Here's what Exodus 21:14 and following says, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death, life for life. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which you may flee. If a man willfully attacks another one in order to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar and he shall die. Now, what that all means is there's a distinction that's made between premeditated murder, where you're lying in wait, or where you're willfully attacking somebody, as compared to something that we might call involuntary manslaughter. You know, you're driving your donkey down the road, somebody runs across the road, you tramp him with his donkey, and he dies. You know, it's like somebody runs across the road, you hit him with your car. We don't call that first-degree murder here. It may be involuntary manslaughter, or it may not even be considered an offense at all if the other person was at fault. But what's behind this is motive. What is the motive here? And where the motive is premeditated, or if the action, and other laws will specify, if you strike a man and you have a rock in your hand, that's not a passion, an act of passion where you just might punch a person. To go through the act of picking up a rock, you're trying to kill that person. You're trying to do serious damage. There's a difference in motive. And the biblical law is always trying to sort out what is the motive here. So the point of this passage is that the purpose of sanctuary is when there's been an involuntary death, accidental death, to prevent you from being the victim of the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You run to the sanctuary to have your case heard. We might call it today a change of venue, where you want to get a fair trial, where you say, look, it was an accident. I was just working. I was pulling my axe back to chop some wood, and he walked up behind me, and boom. I didn't try to kill him. But the family says, we got to avenge the blood. And out they go to try to kill the guy. So the purpose of sanctuary, then, is to provide an opportunity for the case to be heard. In Numbers 35, let me just read this. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns and some cities, and he explains about these 6 towns and so on. And then the last sentence, these 6 towns will be a place of refuge for Israelites and for foreigners residing among you, so that anyone who has killed another accidentally can flee there. The only crime for which the cities of refuge, or the sanctuary cities, had legal relevance in ancient Israel was involuntary manslaughter or accidental death. It wasn't for any crime. And so this is a case, I believe, of taking biblical law and really misapplying it for whatever motivation. I'm not going to accuse anybody of wrong motivations, but they're wrongly using what the Bible, the biblical purpose of the city of refuge is all about. Conclusions. 1, biblical law regarding the ger is best, in my mind, applied to legal immigrants in our system. That is, those who've come in legally, that is, have the permission of the state or the host in ancient tribal society. And then let me just back up to say that it gets a little dicier. And of course, the question automatically comes, well, what about the illegal immigrants? And of course, that is a tough issue. All I'm trying to point out to you today is that when the Bible talks about the ger and all the protections, this is a very different category of person than the nahar, the foreigner. As you can see, in biblical law, they're treated differently legally, socially, in terms of their religious inclusion, etc. They're different categories of people. And the only difference I can see between them in looking at every one of these 162 occurrences of the verbs and nouns is that the ger has permission to be there. The foreigner may be passing through. The foreigner may be a seasonal worker who comes in for a short period of time and goes back to his home. The ger is basically a foreigner who is living permanently and has the permission of the host. The point is, if you invite somebody into your house, think of it this way. Pharaoh invites Israel into his house, and then sometime later they turn around and abuse them. You know, it's just like you invite somebody to be your guest at your home, and then you say something, okay, we want you to wash the dishes, we want you to clean the floor, we want you to wash the bathrooms. That's a great deal for me, right? Because I usually end up having to do those things in our home. But you see, you wouldn't think of doing that to a guest in your home. That would be abusive in a very simple way. So in essence, what was so heinous about what happened to the Israelites is they had been invited in. But then they were turned around and abused and turned into slaves for the benefit of the host nation. And what God is telling the Israelites, you don't do that to other people. You don't invite people in only to abuse them, to exploit them, to take advantage of them. And so these laws are to protect those people who don't have those natural protections. The American legal practice of sanctuary cities is designed to protect illegal immigrants primarily. That's what they're used for today. Has nothing to do with the biblical practice of sanctuary. So those are two of my conclusions. Now, let me just wrap up, and then we'll have any questions or discussion. What I've tried to do is look carefully at what the Bible is saying without any preconceived ideas of where this was going to go. I didn't come into this with an agenda. It's where the data left me. It's where the data led me. I was surprised when I went into the New Testament to find that the New Testament has very little to say on this subject. In fact, what the New Testament says is that we, the Christians, are the sojourners. We're like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't have a home. We're part of a kingdom that's not of this world. And therefore, we're looking for a city whose maker and builder is the Lord. So we're in this awkward position of being sojourners ourselves in a spiritual sense. The Christian community was not identified by land. And so there is some obvious rethinking that needs to be done because it's a different paradigm in terms of church, country, and let's say ancient Israel. That's a clear identifiable landmass And so that's why it's not always easy to take those laws and then pop them in to the Christian worldview in which we are the sojourners. We're the ones who will be mistreated for our faith and so on, or should be, under normal circumstances. So it is somewhat surprising that while the New Testament deals with foreigners and welcoming foreigners to the church and things like that, it's not dealing with the same sorts of issue that ancient Israel did that had an identifiable country. Christians were a part of the Roman world and lived in all kinds of different countries. So it's a very different scenario. But at least when we think of ourselves as the aliens, in the New Testament sense, it may give us perhaps a little more of an appreciation for and concern for the alien in our midst. And so for me, I'm always one who in our church, when I see a person who looks different, who looks like they don't belong in white suburbia, we're the first ones to go up and try to welcome them and bring them into our community. And let me give you just a practical illustration, because we did have an African family in our church who, in the course of their time with us, had a change in their immigration status. And they were in the difficult situation of having to be potentially have to leave the country. And so our church helped them with legal expenses. And because they were caught in this quandary between two different systems of staying in the country, one was that you can stay but you can't work, which, okay, that's kind of dumb. You could only work as a religious worker, but the church didn't have enough money for them to be full-time. All kinds of silly things like that. So the church actually helped with legal expenses to see an immigration lawyer, have them understand what their rights are. And I'm not saying this in any way to pat myself in the back, but just to let you know that my wife and I, for the past 3 years, over that 3-year stretch, has actually contributed $15,000 to their living expenses. That this is a conviction we had, that these are people who are caught in a system that's kind of misfired on them. But working with the system, we were able, in the course of some years, to get their status normalized. So now they can work and they can do, but it took a while. But the church was willing to step in, and not only me, but other families were able to help this family to survive. And so I think there are very practical things that churches and people can do. But just to let you know that's how we came about trying to help them, even though they were in jeopardy. And I told my friend, I said, look, if this doesn't work out, I want you to leave the country. It's the right thing to do. It's the legal thing to do. You may not like it. It may be hard for your family, but it's the right thing to do. Well, praise God, it worked out for him to stay on. But I think that so often churches are trying to do things like, we're going to create this sanctuary and nobody can come in, and we're going to keep these people and protect them. And in the end, you don't help them. There was a woman who, for a year, was in a sanctuary situation in a church in Chicago, and the minute she walked out, she was arrested and deported. So it's like, well, a lot of good that church did for a year, just keeping them sitting, poor woman sitting there where she could do nothing, instead of practically helping her with her immigration issues. But in any event, I'd just throw that out to let you know that there are things churches can do in very practical ways, and individuals, to help immigrants who get caught in these legal loopholes, which I think are unfortunate but can be dealt with. So I stop there and see if you have any questions or comments. Yes?
You're talking in an ideal setting, right? And the law, it's important. Concern still has, many times you have people that immigrate from other countries, sending them back is a death trap. And it seems like the person takes precedence over the law, correct?
I'm sorry?
It seems like the person or the well-being of the person takes precedence over the law. A refugee from another country going back to their home country that's war-torn and sending them to death.
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing a greater injustice in that case, right? I mean, it seems that
Well, I think that, I mean, what you're, my concern is where we allow, I mean, this is for instance, what your argument, in a sense, if you follow it logically, it's like the person who says, we must allow for therapeutic abortions because the life of the mother is at stake, therefore we should allow all abortions. There's that kind of leap there between the exception, which defines the rule. And so, but I do think, and in the case of our friends that I was talking about, they were one of those countries. A war-torn country. They were able to get a special immigration status because it was a political refugee situation. But when the war in that country ended, their status changed. That was the issue. There was democratic elections in their country, democratic government. There's no reason the people couldn't return. It's just that they liked it here better. So the political crisis that caused them to flee the country was now over. 10 years had passed. Okay? So yeah, and our government does have all kinds of provisions for it. In fact, of the 1 million people who legally are admitted to immigrant status in the U.S., nearly a half are political refugees who come each year, and about the other half are people who go through the application process. So there are about 500,000 a year who come into the country from those kind of situations that you're talking about.
No, I mean, I realize some of the challenges, and it's not as clear-cut in all things.
Absolutely.
I mean, your situation at the church worked out beautifully, correct?
It did, but again, it was because we worked with the legal system.
Sure.
Rather than to say we're going to defy the system, we're going to say what are our options? How can we help this man get a immigration lawyer? We help pay those expenses. Again, so my admonition is, and again, I didn't get into Romans 13 and authority of government and all that, but is we can work with the system, and I think churches can do that. And again, there are those really tough situations, and I admit those are gut-wrenching things, and I always say what I try to do is think of in terms of a balance between law and grace, to find that balance between law and grace.
I have a question. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments towards the U.S. law system, because I think the biblical law is very clear and very pure because it's from God, but every country sets up, at least in my short life experience, what I've observed is every country sets up its laws to secure and acquire and protect itself. And even when there's generosity to foreigners, it's to an extent. And when you cross that line, the nationals of that country kind of have that instinctive reaction to build up, to protect themselves.
Sure.
And that's our human nature. And I think I really appreciate you mentioning that in the New Testament, we are called as Christians to not live so much for ourselves. However, it's a natural and human way to live life and secure those boundaries. So I appreciate totally having laws and following them. I'm wondering if you have a comment regarding how laws of the nation should be addressed from a Christian perspective to deal with injustices, because I believe there are injustices in every nation regarding how foreigners are treated. And especially in this nation, if I could narrow it down more, with the flip between come and work and then go home. And I'm wondering if you can address that, because this is a really strong nation. I don't think this conversation would look the same if you were talking about it from another country, say Kenya. But the U.S. is huge. It's huge with 51 states, and it's incredibly strong and incredibly driven economically.
Yeah.
And so,
well, if you're gonna approach it by size and geography, then there's a lot of room in Russia and Canada.
Which is why I added the economy
they're bigger,
as well, and the driving force, because it's very strong.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point. That I travel all over the world. And, you know, when I go to England, which I do quite a bit, I get a stamp in my passport that says you can stay here for 3 months and you can't work and you can't apply for any social benefits. Well, I'm not going to push it and say, well, I'm going to stay 3 months and 1 day and then I'm going to show up at the social service office and say, hey, I want some help. I just say, okay. When I went to New Zealand, same sort of thing. So I spent most of my growing up years in Egypt, and this is you know, where my parents worked as missionaries, and you know, we had to submit to the laws we didn't like, but we were guests in their country, and so we always figured it was our obligation to follow the law as best we could. I mean, yes, it was illegal for us to witness to Muslims, but if we had the opportunity, we were going to. You know, there's sometimes you say, okay, government doesn't have right to do certain things, and those are the tough things, how you make the decision about those. But I would say that and we have friends here from China. Praise God, they came from Shanghai to work for a company in Carroll Stream. My good friend of mine is the manager of is VP for IT, and they have an office in Shanghai. And he had to go through a lot of to get this guy to be able to work at the corporate office in the States. I mean, it's unbelievable, all the loops they had to go through. And this was something who worked for their company, you know, it's an international company, to bring them to the States to work, to head up their programming department. Anyway, I'm trying to make a long story short, but they got their permits. They, praise God, in the course of time, they both came to know the Lord and were baptized. And we're in my Bible study group and have grown. But you know, they've gone through the legal process, and now they've got a change of status, and now they can apply for a green card and so on. So here's somebody who came in on a short-term employment basis, but they were permitted to apply for longer term once they were here, and you know, things seem to be lining up for them to stay on if they so choose. So you know, I think for the unfortunate stories where things don't work out, I can point to many where they do when people play by the rules. I start my book with a story of a guy named George, who I met, and this was when I was first in graduate school, and I was involved in college and career ministry at a church. And this guy comes in, and I'd gotten to know him, and I found out that he was not a Canadian. He was in the country illegally, and he didn't want to leave. And so he's asked me, what should I do? Should I go underground? Should I go to the States and apply for, you know, and he was wrestling back and forth and back and forth. And I said to him, George, I said, the best thing for you to do is to do the legal thing. Look at your legal options. And I never saw him again. But years later, I found out from a mutual friend that he had gone to the States, gone to the Canadian embassy, made his application, was able to then legally re-enter Canada, and since became a citizen and so on. So I think, you know, he had a decision to make at that point. Do I go a legal route, or do I just sort of slip into the underground economy and get lost for the next whatever years? You know, again, I'm thankful that he followed that advice and you know, hopefully is living happily ever after. So I think there are, you know, often people have to make a decision how they're going to play the game, which way they're going to go. And, you know, sometimes the process is hectic and you wish it could be streamlined. I know people who it's taken 10 years for their legal status to be, and by the way, it's worse for people who live outside of the country and apply to get in. I've had friends in Egypt in that very situation. It took them 10 years.
I'm on a non-immigrant visa myself. Obviously, from my accent, I'm not a national of this country. So I thoroughly appreciate the process and the frustration and the benefits, because there are laws that hinder me but I have appreciated how they're there to protect me,
Sure.
even though they are difficult for me. It's not easy
Yeah.
for me to work and survive in this country as it would be for a citizen.
Sure.
But I can understand why some of those laws were put in place. But the reason I'm asking this in regarding the U.S. law is because being here from, honestly, I tell you, all of you who have U.S. passports, I joke that other than a U.S. passport, the next best thing is a heaven passport, because that little blue booklet does wonders that no other passport I have seen can do. And so there's something that I've appreciated being a foreigner myself, without that U.S. passport, without a symbol of strength, that has made me really empathize with the Mexican community especially. And I'll name that specifically because I have appreciated, I've been here for 3 years, and I have seen different social dynamics. And my position here is not the same as it was in Kenya. I wasn't struggling as much as I've struggled here, because the cost of living and family structures and everything, familiarity, it's different.
Sure.
I appreciate being a foreigner in another land and struggling. But there's a difference I've seen, because I know many Africans who just need to make it out. Like, that's the perception. And I actually used to really, I'm sorry I'm taking a little bit long, but I really used to look down on Africans who would leave to come and make a life in the States, because I would think that's thoroughly unpatriotic and loyal, and not loyal. But while I've been here, I've realized I'm so privileged as an educated African woman from a stable family who has a home I can go back to. And I can't judge the African who has nothing when they want to just make it to the States, because here you can survive and you
Sure.
can build a life from nothing
Yeah.
in a way you couldn't have at home. But the reason I narrow this down, especially to the Mexican communities, because it's very different flying all the way from Africa than it is being able to walk
Sure.
across somewhere. And so with that reality of I can walk across there and my life could be so much different.
Yeah.
I'll work just as hard, but I'll have a life.
Yeah.
I'll have basic needs met if I can just make it there.
Sure.
And especially when there's the opportunity. You know, I think if US law said you can never hire someone who does not have the papers, not as many people would come in. And that's why I'm wondering if as Christians we could speak to not just helping. It's great and it's good to help the person who's close to you through the means that you have. But there are so many, many, many others who are being, in a sense, lured in. And if you're desperate and you see work,
Sure.
you'll come. And so can we
Very
speak to
understandable.
addressing those laws, as well as remedying the
Well,
problem that exists already?
I do believe that you cannot employ an illegal immigrant, that the liability falls on the employer currently. Now, a lot do that. I'm sorry?
It depends on the employer and how desperately they need you.
Oh yes, I understand that, but from you asked me in terms of the law. I think the law is already clear, but I think what happens is many employers realize that they can exploit the illegal immigrant by paying them less. When my son was in high school and looking for a summer job, he went to a place and he was offered a job. He was offered below minimum wage, with no benefits. They wouldn't pay his Social Security, all those things. And my son was, well, what do I do, Dad? He told me if I don't take it, he says, I can get some Mexican guy to do it for this month, so you either take it or leave it. So suddenly, that illegal immigrant kid is keeping my son from getting a job at the minimum wage because he will take it so my son ended up taking the job for under minimum wage. He says, what do I do, Dad? I can't find any other job. So I recognize that these are very real issues, and the magnet issue, you know, the fact that we are here is I understand that. And if you're in poverty, I can understand the person who wants to help their family, improve these are very real things. Look, my wife's family came from China for those reasons. So I understand that. So these are very real issues, and I don't think that they are going to be what I see is that you have politically conservative people who are eager to exploit the illegal immigrant for cheap labor, the business community. On the other hand, you have the political left thinking, we want them to come in because they'll be good voters for us. So both sides have something they think is going to be their advantage, and in the meantime, these people get caught in a system that's abusing them, either for their cheap labor or for a vote. To me, it's despicable on both sides. So obviously there needs to be some legal reforms. You're right. But, and that's a good thing, you know, that people who care about these things can advocate, can lobby, can seek to change laws. And so that's something good. And the history of Christianity has been one in which Christians have been at the forefront of social change in government.
We'll take two more questions.
John, back.
Thank you. I just wanted some quick clarification on the Numbers 35:11 through 15 verse, speaking to the sanctuary cities. Mm-hmm. It said that they would be a sanctuary to those who had committed what would be equated to involuntary manslaughter and accidental murder. And it would be open to Israelites and foreigners. Mm-hmm. And in all of your other examples where you had something translated foreigner, it was actually the Nachar word, as opposed to the Ger word, which was translated sojourner. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, was that just a mistranslation, or?
I'd have to look at the Hebrew of that, but it does create a bit of a dilemma because foreigners weren't even allowed in the sanctuary. So yeah, I'm not sure how that one will work out. Whether it's Ger or Nachar, I could check very easily. But as I was reading over that, I said, I bet somebody's going to ask me that. So thank you for asking. I'll have to double check.
I was wondering if you see, in your opinion, if you see like establishing a guest worker program and having opportunities for children who were born here, who didn't come here but were born here from illegal families. I forget the name of that program. Yeah. Do you see that as advancing those programs as being a reasonable accommodation between law and grace? Yeah, well, that's obviously, invariably we get to these kind of questions, and I can very easily duck that by saying, well, the Bible doesn't really address that. Biblical law doesn't really take those kinds of issues on. But the one thing that does occur to me, and I know there's this wonderful issue of Christianity Today recently that was dealing with these kinds of questions, these kinds of individuals. So on the one hand, and I'm having a conversation with myself, okay? So I'm letting you sit in on the conversation with myself. On the one hand, you say, why should these kids suffer? Or not, why should they be penalized for the illegal conduct of their parents, right? So on the one hand, you can look at that and say, that seems very reasonable to grant normalization status for these kids. So that's the conversation on one side of my head. The other side of my head says, the man who robs a bank so that he can send his kid to college, should that kid benefit from his father's crime? The person who commits a crime and the father goes to jail, we say, well, we shouldn't send the man to jail because who's going to take care of his wife and kid? And so that's both sides of my head talking, because I can see, yeah, there's a logic here and there's a logic here. There's compassion here and there's, And so it's not an easy issue, and I think that's why politically it's a hard issue to work out, because if one illegal act is rewarded, then are you going to get more of the same? Because again, you're creating the magnet. You're attracting people in on the basis, well, we're allowing your kids to become citizens by virtue of birth, even though you got here and stayed here, illegally. These are tough questions, and so I'm going to duck that by saying I can see the argument going both ways, and I know that's not very helpful, but that's why I say with what we're talking about, there are not a lot of easy answers.
But I mean, could we maybe couple that with better enforcement? As you were making your presentation, part of me was thinking, you talk about the Israelites inviting people in, and to me it's like our immigration policies have been so slipshod and the enforcement has been so slipshod. We've kind of invited these people in. I mean, de facto, we've kind of said,
well, yes, I think by virtue,
you've kind of said, here's our borders, a wink, wink.
I think you're quite right. I think you're absolutely right. But I would say that there could be some significant reworking and refinement of our guest worker program. They already exist. They're called a 1H, I think it's called. But I think some of that needs to be reviewed, rethought, and but I think the problem with our legal system is that it's overwhelmed with so many people in so many cases with immigration law. So these are some of the dilemmas. But I agree that, and by the way, that's why I was suggesting those workers coming to Egypt. They were guest workers. They had a permit. How many could come in and so on. So this is something that people have dealt with for a long time and done so successfully. This is becoming a big issue now in the EU with people coming from poorer countries like Romania and Bulgaria, and they're all just flooding into England. And the Brits are, what's going on here? We're completely overrun. And I just reading about that in the paper this week that England's really trying to figure out how to handle this, because it's really driving down. It's creating an unemployment problem for them. But the EU, anybody can travel anywhere, do anything, and you've got poorer people who are willing to take the low-end jobs, and now the low-end jobs aren't available for the youth coming out of high school, and so there's all these social dynamics. So it's not just an American problem. It's really a European problem, an Australian problem. It's all over. So yeah. Many tough issues, and let me just conclude by saying hopefully we gain some wisdom from Scripture into helping us, and I think we need to pray for those, especially Christian lawmakers, to have great wisdom and trying to be equitable. And as I say, find this balance between law and grace. It's not an easy thing to do. But in any event, hopefully, at least I've provided some basis for thinking about some of these things.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Hoffmeier. Let's thank Dr. Hoffmeier for coming. And the Gospel in the Public Square is also going to have at some point this semester or next semester something on marriage, on the Christian and economics. And we're looking to do something else with the death penalty. So those are a few things coming up, just social issues. And Kevin's going to close our time in prayer. If you guys just stick around for a quick prayer here.
You would bow your heads with me. Dear Lord, we're so thankful for your word. Thankful for people like Dr. Hoffmeier to help us understand your word better. Lord God, we pray you would help us apply your word to our lives. Help us be people of mercy, of justice, people characterized walking with you. Lord God, help us just be wise. Help us understand